Will giving acts of generosity, they heal the spirit and the soul. They produce an echo reverberating throughout this world, an echo that never really fades. Acts of generosity connect us to one another and to God. And in that connection, as we saw with the children, that is when we find healing. Healing for our feelings of isolation, the burdens of loneliness. It is in that connection with one another and God that we find hope for our most divine dreams. It is that connection in which we find peace for all of our disappointments with life, even the disappointments that we find with ourselves. And it is there in that connection that we find the courage and we feel God's Spirit and direction for our future. And yet there are times when we feel disconnected. Disconnected from one another. Disconnected from God, from grace, from hope. And this certainly was the case during the Holocaust. Millions felt caught in a graceless void into which the flow of God's mercy felt like it had run dry. And yet, even there were sparks of God's goodness. Viktor Frankl, a Nazi concentration camp survivor, says, "We who lived in the concentration camps can remember those who walked through the huts, comforting others, giving away even their last piece of bread. Now they may have been few in number," he says, "but they offered sufficient proof that everything can be taken away from a person, but one thing, the last of their freedoms, the ability to choose. And these few made the choice, despite all that they had seen, all that they had suffered, despite all that they lacked. They chose to live out the spirit of compassion and generosity. Grace-filled acts of generosity healed also Leon Layson and connected him to God. Leon, like Viktor Frankl, was a concentration camp prisoner. He was, until Itzhak Stern, himself a Jew, the accountant at Oskar Schindler's factory in Czechoslovakia, forged documents for Leon, as he had for 1,000 others, to make it appear that even though Leon was only 11, that he was a valuable machinist rather than someone deemed expendable, as so many teachers and intellectuals were deemed, and that meant certain death. So reclassified by Stern, Leon was transferred to the camp, from the concentration camp to Schindler's factory, where he lived under his protection. At the end of the war, in May of 1945, Russian soldiers liberated Schindler's factory. And Leon says they offered him and the others in the factory a chance to strike back at the German soldiers, or at least to take their boots, for their feet were bare. And Leon refused. To take revenge, he would later say in his life, would have been absolutely insane. The person that I picked might have been a perfectly innocent person with a family and with children. I would not take myself down to that level. In the long run, I knew that I could stand up taller in my life without those boots. The choice of grace, levied by Stern and Schindler, the choice to be generous, with care and concern, with material support and protection, changed the course not only of Leon's life, but also his soul. his soul. The act of generosity connected him to God's own Spirit. It created a legacy of generosity to live up to and to carry on in his own life. These acts by Stern and Schindler inspired him. They allowed him to stand tall throughout his life. At his funeral last year, his daughter reflected on Leon's life. She said he talked about how at 11 he had to stand upon a box to operate the factory machines. But he also talked throughout his life that how, despite the brutality, the terror, the starvation that he endured, his spirit had healed in time. And it started that healing when Stern and Schindler made the choice of generosity, to share care and concern for financial resources to help save complete strangers. Grace flowing through others when they are connected manifests God's own Spirit, even in the midst of a deep, desperate darkness. The choice made by the few that Frankel witnessed in the concentration camp, the choice made by Stern and Schindler, were powerful choices. They were dangerous choices. They did not end the war, they did not end the Holocaust, but their choices did bring about a measure of healing. Those choices did have the power to restore spirits, to save souls, and sometimes even lives. Their choices were the same choices that were made by Jesus throughout his ministry. With like choices, Jesus healed the 10 lepers and others. With like choices, generous choices, Jesus lit the flame of hope when it had grown dim in others. And Jesus brought comfort and direction to those that were hurting and those that were lost. But only the one leper who returned to give thanks, only that one leper who made the choice to carry on the legacy of grace and generosity that he was given, received healing not only for his body, but also for his soul. Giving thanks through acts of generosity heals the soul. We too, like those 10 lepers, we each have been recipients of God's grace in one way or another. We each have inherited the legacy created by the acts of graceful generosity given by Jesus. And so this morning as we come here, we too have a choice. Like the 10 lepers had a choice. How will we respond to the grace and generosity given to us? Will we keep the legacy of Jesus alive? Will we, given the choice to strike back at those that have hurt us, offer forgiveness and compassion instead, as Leon did? Will we, given the choice, the ability to purchase our isolation away from the world's troubles, instead stand in solidarity with those who suffer? Will we, given the choice to live only for ourselves, instead bind ourselves to others with Jesus-like acts of generosity and grace? I think we will. I think we will. Because I see it here every Sunday morning. Every Sunday, something truly remarkable happens here among us. Here in this place, judges and doctors, lawyers and laborers, waitresses and chefs, we all gather together. Those who have been extraordinarily successful, those who did not know where they would spend that night, have gathered together here. Those who grieve a child, those who are expecting a child, those that are our children gather together. Children in accelerated classes, children who need additional attention and care, get it from our church school aides as they gather together upstairs. Those who have been diagnosed with cancer, those who fight addictions, those who have suffered abuse, have lost a job, a home, or hope. Gather together. And we gather together, we connect with one another, fighting the forces that would normally separate us in this world, but do not hear in these pews. We find in each other the whisper of God's wisdom. We find the challenge to go deeper in our faith. We find healing for our very souls. We gather just as our forebears did in faith, gathered together with Jesus. Those disciples then gathered around Jesus, but they did not, and we do not, create a perfect community. At times we fail one another. At times we argue just as they argue. But at other times, they and we are faithfully courageous. And even in our imperfection, we gather still to support one another, to learn of God's generosity, and to reflect it in our own lives, that we, together, connected together, may create moments of grace that help one another stand in this world a little taller. And we gather because through each other we find our connection to God in a way that does in fact heal broken and fearful and grieving souls. Nowhere else in the world does that happen. Yes, there are charities in this world, and they do great and tremendous work. But almost always, outside of the church, there are clear distinctions, separations between benefactor and client. But here in these pews, we are each, all of us, both benefactor and client. We are each in different ways in need of God's grace, and we each have something to offer one another. We each have some form of gift, of generosity to offer that will then allow God's grace to emerge between us. This church is a special place. Our ability to be connected, despite our huge diversity, demonstrated by the melting pot which we just had last week, is truly unique. That model is desperately in need in this world. For if the world is ever to know peace, the peace will be built upon expanding what happens right here every Sunday morning. A community of disparate people connecting, sitting side by side to gain hope and strength and support from one another. A place that despite all that would separate us in this world, we are still willing to reach out, to join hands, so that the healing grace of God flows through us and into the world. This week, you will receive a letter from our stewardship committee. The letter will ask you to continue the legacy of grace that we have all inherited as a community here in this church. I urge you, when you get that letter, to remember it is and it has always been that acts of grace through generous giving is what heals the soul. It's what changes lives. It's what changes this world into a more loving place. It starts there. Connect yourself to God. Connect yourself to others in this congregation by giving as generously as you can. By doing so, you will stand a little taller. And together in our connection with one another, we will see and revel in the wonderful things that God's Spirit can do through us when we add what little we have. Amen.